Hello guys, so welcome back to another video. So today we are going to be talking about data binding in Go Fyne application. So data binding is mostly used to connect the user interface with the data source that you're going to be using in your applications. So let's get started. With me here I have a very simple application. We can make this 400 and then we run it so that we see how the application looks like. So that's a simple application. So let's get started. So let's start with two-way data binding. Two-way data binding. In this example, we're going to create a string, and then we're going to set its value, and then we're going to bind them to certain activities. So we're just going to create a string called str, and then we're going to bind it. This is how you define a new binding, and then you're going to have new string. So when you are binding data, it supports the various data types. It supports an integer, it supports a float, it supports a string, and many other data types as seen in Go. So here we are binding a new string, and then we can set its value. Maybe say hello fine. So this is like some kind of our label, and then we're going to bind it to the label itself. And then we're going to say widget dot new label with data. We're going to define the string that we just defined, and then we're going to also bind this to an entry so that when we make an entry, it is going to change the value. So it's going to be widget dot new entry with data, and then you're going to bind it to the str as well. So data binding helps us to avoid, because normally when you're dealing with Fyne, you create a label and then you're going to add maybe an onChange event listener so that when you change it, it's going to update. But this one, using data binding help us to avoid all the hassle of creating a label and then updating it later on. So we're going to bind it to a value initially, and then it's going to be changing. So we can display this and then see how it looks like. So here we can come and say, let's get rid of this, and then we can come and say maybe the label container, so that it's going to be a container dot new grid with columns. Then I'm just going to say 2, then I'm going to define the label, the entry. So we have binded this entry with this label. Then we can come and display it here, the label container. Then we can run this to see how it looks like. So we can see here there is no onChange handler or anything. So let's try just typing anything here. Hello Fyne, how are you doing? So another way of doing this is you can define a label and then you add an onChange handler so that when anything changes here, you update this label. So this is another way of doing those changes, or applying those changes using data binding. So another example we can look at is a float, because this one was a string. We can look at a float example, and then we can define a float value. We can define a float val, because data binding can support various data types. Binding dot new, see even boolean and list, new float, and then we can set a value, set an initial value of maybe 40.0, and then now we can add a slider so that when the slider changes, we can be updating this value. So we can say maybe formatted string, because you have to convert the float, the float to a string. Then we're going to say here binding.float to string with format, and then we define our float value, the one that we have already defined up there, and then you're going to say value, this is what you're going to be. Then you can format a string, and then we're going to add a label, so we're going to say float label, and then we're going to say widget dot new label with the data. Then we're going to pass our formatted string. So what you're going to do here now, I'm going to define a slider so that you can be binding the data with this UI. So you're going to have a slider which is going to be a widget dot new slider, and then you're going to say it's going to be 0 to 100, 0 to 100, and then you're going to bind the slider that binds to the float value. Then now we're going to display it. So to display it, you're going to also copy this one, and then you're going to say here float label, no float container, and then here we're going to have the float label. So as you can see here, we're binding a float, a label with an input to the user interface with the data we're supplying there. We are binding them first, defining them first, then with the label here, this is for conversion. Then we define the label, and this is our UI. So this is the UI for this one, and the label, this one is for binding the data. Then this is going to be capturing that, and then the user interface, its UI is the entry. Now we're going to define a layout so that we can be able to display all this. So it's going to say container dot new head split. I want them to be side by side. And then I'm going to need these to the label container. The float container should be on the left, and then we're going to should be on the right. So I'm going to say let's just say label container, and then the float container. Then we can say layout. Yeah, so let's see how this is going to look like. Okay, so yeah, this one is still working, and then when I create this, it is also working. So this is the user interface. These are the values that we have binded. Okay, another example that we can look at is we can look at binding a list of items using you can display a list, and then we bind it to a certain data source. So we can start by defining our data, because we have to bind it first. Binding, we have to bind it first. Binding dot new string list, and then we're going to set our values. So this data dot set our initial values. Then we're going to say that, let's say maybe item 1, item 2, and item 3. So you can see here, every time we have to bind something, we have to define it, using this binding.NewString. So that's going to be a list of strings. For float, we have binding.NewFloat, and then we set the value. For string, also do the same, newString. But since this is a list, you have to use the newString list. And then after defining it, now we can start displaying it. And as we saw it in the previous video, we normally used widgets. But new list, that's what we used to use. We're going to use this, but now we have our data source. We want to bind it to a certain data source. So we're going to say new label with new label, no, new list. Should be new list, not label. New list with data, and then we're going to define our data initially. And then after defining our data, now we're going to add our create item and our canvas object. So for the create item, I'm just going to say func, going to be a fine canvas object, and then we're going to have to return a label for the one that will be updating. Once we have captured our data, new label, we can make it empty. After that, we're going to list our update item, and then you're going to get the item. This one is for the item, and this is for the object. So we're going to have to capture all those things. Then we're going to say string item. Then we have to make sure that it is binded item dot, going to bind it, binding dot. So if binding is okay, then no, this is supposed to be di. Make sure that we can bind it. If it's binded, then now we can. So we have to confirm that the binding happened. So if doesn't work, we have to log something. So we're going to say log .println. Then we're going to say item. That means binding never happened. It's not a binding string. Then we're going to finally return co, update the label. We're going to bind the label, widget.label. The label, of course, we have created up there. .bind item. Then now we have this list. I want to add a user interface because this is going to be displayed. I want to add a user entry whereby the user can add more lists. So we can say new item, going to be given by the annual entry, and then you're going to add button, so that when the button is clicked, you add that item. So widget new button, then I'm going to say add item. I'm going to define the function so that when it's clicked, that item is going to be added. So we're going to first capture the item text from the user entry. So it's going to be new item dot text, so that we capture the user entry. And then if it is empty, no, if it is not empty, you're going to append it, list data dot append. We're going to append it to our list item text, and then finally set the new item dot set text to empty after we have successfully added it. Now, and to add the add item container, so I can just copy this. Also be agreed, I can say maybe the list container, and then you're going to have the new item, and then you're also going to add the button, so that when you click it, add button, so that when you click it, it's going to display. Then I want this to be on the left side and the list is going to be on the right side. So I'm going to get this, and then I'm going to say container .new viewbox. I'm going to use a vertical box, and then this other side is going to be the list, to display the list, and then here we remain with the list container. Then what we're going to do here is I'm going to create another layout here and call it content, so that I can restructure it well. Content, and then I'm going to use a container new border, and then at the top I'm going to have the list container, and then nil, and then finally I'm going to display the layout. So here I'm going to have the content, and then now we can run it and see how this looks like. Yes, so this is going to be our application. So I can say maybe hello Moshi. As you can see, it's binding so well. And then here you can see the value, the float value, and then you can add another item 4, you can add another item 5, and it's working fine. So guys, this is how you can bind your values without using the on-change handlers and so on. You can just bind them so that you can be able to also update these data value from a given data source. And the more you can just append, as you can see, we appended to a list and it's automatically displayed. So if you have an external data source, you can also call the reload so that it can be updated. The user interface can be updated for a good user experience. So thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next video.